Hello and welcome to the 12th video in this series, making a space shooter using some HTML and JavaScript. So this video then we're going to look at making our bullets hit the enemies and increase the player's score and get the enemy ship to vanish when this happens. First thing I want to do in defs.js is add in a new parameter and call this bullet top and make it equal to 10, and then I'm going to change the fire rate to 200 so I actually hit something later on. The bullet top is simply, I'll just go to the browser. So imagine we have an enemy being generated off screen. As we know, they're always slightly off screen and then they travel onto the screen. And we're firing a bullet, let's say in this direction. And the bullet then collides here with the enemy. It'll still hit the enemy and the enemy will be killed and we'll get some score. But from our point of view playing the game, it'll look a bit odd. No enemy comes on the screen and we get the score increase, something we don't know what's happened. So that bullet top is going to say that if the top of the bullet is less than 10 pixels, then it's no longer able to hit anything. So it's a little bit of a hack just to make sure that strange visual things don't happen. So how do we know then whether the bullet actually hit an enemy? There are lots of ways of doing this, and we're going to do it in a very rough way for demonstration here. We're going to do some collision detection, very rudimentary. You'll see when I click on the enemy sprite here, the red circle, I've got a rectangle. This is its containing box or bounding box or whatever you'd like to say. I call it a containing box all around it, which we, when we create the sprite, can define as a property. And the way we're going to detect collisions is simply to see if the rectangle of a bullet sprite overlaps or intersects with the rectangle of an enemy sprite. Now, of course, if you're writing a more sophisticated game, people would get annoyed with the collision detection where the bullet, if it's here, collides with the enemy and the detection looks perfect. But of course, if it's here, the rectangles intersect, but they're nowhere near actually colliding from the player's point of view. What you do then is write some more sophisticated code to detect the collision, but we'll do it for simplicity just by the intersected rectangles. To do that then, I need to add a function into my rectangle class, where for the rectangle in question I can ask, am I intersected by another rectangle? I'll paste this in. It's a very simple piece of code. It simply says if the origin of me, so let's say the enemy sprite, is greater in the x than the max of the bullet sprite, or the other way around, then on the x they can't be overlapping in any way, therefore there's no intersection, we can return false. Exactly the same for the origin, and then if neither of these conditions are satisfied, then we can simply return true and everything's okay. When you've got single statements like this after the if, you don't need the curly braces around them. I'll put them in though, it looks a little bit better, I guess. So that function then should be fairly self-explanatory. We're just asking ourselves, is this rectangle intersected by another rectangle? Importantly though, we need to go into our sprite class now, and this is where using extension of classes is quite helpful. I want to add a new property, and I'm going to add a new property called the containing box. And this is a new rectangle which is generated from the position of the sprite, and then its size, width, and size height. And what I do need to do then, you'll remember that the rect class has an update function here where we update the max, the origin, etc. I do need to make sure I keep this updated every time I update my position in some way. So just down in set position, update position, and increment position, all of those functions individually, I'll make sure I keep my containing box for my sprites up to date. And that means because we extend the sprite for the player, the enemies, and the bullets, we always have this containing box then available. So the tricky part of all this then is in the enemy collection. I'm in enemy.js now. First thing I want to do here is write a reset function, which we'll use in the main.js, because at the moment every time we reset the game we generate a new collection. The first thing is to call the kill all when I reset to get rid of all of the enemies. And then I'm going to take most of this stuff here in the constructor, just take out the player reference here, to reset all of our scores to 0. The other thing I want to do now in the constructor is actually take a reference now to the bullets that are existing in the game, because it will do the detection of the bullet collision in the update part of this enemy collection. That also then means I'll need a bullets property on my enemy collection. So now what we can do is go down into here, into the update logic, and have a look in here. I'm going to take this if list enemy state, game settings enemy state dead, and just paste that onto here, so that makes that an else if, and then I'm going to change this to moving to waypoint. So if we're dead, we'll remove ourselves, otherwise we'll update ourselves. To make the code a little bit easier to read, I'm going to make a temporary variable for the enemy, and this can be list enemies I here because we'll need it later on. We can already put the enemy instead of that here so it's easier to read. And in here then we're going to write the logic for the bullet collision. The way we're going to do this is simply loop through the list of bullets that we have. So we have a for loop that loops through all of the bullets in the bullets list and saves this in a variable here, which we can then use to make the code a little bit smaller and easier to read. And now we're going to ask ourselves some questions. The first one is we're going to ask, is the bullet actually on the board? So is its Y greater than the bullet top? Is it dead or not? And does it intersect the enemy's containing box? If all those three conditions are met, then the bullet has collided with the enemy. So there we have our logic then in the if statement. And if this is the case, first thing we want to do is kill the bullet, which will set the bullet then to dead. Reduce the lives of the enemy. And now if the enemy has 0 lives or less, increment the score of the prayer because the enemy has been destroyed, and kill the enemy. And that's all we need to do for our logic for the bullets to be colliding. So what we should see, assuming I haven't made any massive spelling errors anywhere, is we should see our score go up as we kill the enemies. We should see the enemies then disappear off the screen. Just down the bottom of here, just very quickly, I'm going to hide this second sequence here so we can kill all of the enemies. And now I'm going to go into main.js and add in a little bit of the logic for the resetting of the enemies here. And what that does here then is just create our or reset our enemies. It creates it new if we don't have anything defined already, otherwise just calls reset on the object that we already have. And that should be all we need to get the game going and allow us to actually destroy the enemies. So let's go and have a look at this in the browser. So of course I had a couple of errors there. One was the containing box should have been a big I on intersected by it, and I actually spelt the increment score function slightly incorrectly, so I tried it in the browser and got a couple of errors. Let's try again. And there you see it, we killed 2 enemies and the game over straight away. Press space to reset, start the game again with space. Let's try and kill them again. Even for me it's not that difficult. And our score also has become 200 as well. Very good. So that's got us then able to collide our bullets with the enemy and get scores shown on the screen for killing the enemies as well. Last thing I'll do quickly before forgetting is go back down to the bottom of the code in the enemy and put this enemy sequence back on here. And that's it then for this video. I hope it made some sense. It was a bit lighter than the previous videos. Thanks very much for watching. Comments, questions, welcome as always on YouTube.